Mark Coleman here for Container Solutions, speaking to Andrew Phillips, VP of Product Management for Xebialabs. Do I say it like that? Xebia?
You want to say it like that? That works for me. You call it what you want to call it. No, I think it's Xebialabs, obviously, but here in the States, people turn that into Xebia. And life at the end of the alphabet is, it is what it is. But no, you got that perfectly fine.
Okay, so I'm going to go with Xebia, just so that we've got one pronunciation throughout the interview. So, Andrew, full disclosure, I know you from TomTom a while back. Makes the conversation a little bit more free-flowing than me sort of pretending that, oh, like, how do you know that? How do you know that? You came back into my sort of thinking when I saw your 8 things that we really need to be thinking about in 2015 if we're using Docker containers post. Which went out end of last year or beginning of this year?
End of last year. It was my Christmas message, I think. It was after 6 days of practically continuous eating. The other version of continuous delivery, but let's not go into those kind of details. And and I was sort of reflecting on, trying to, obviously have some time and think about what I thought was particularly interesting about all the stuff we'd seen go by in 2014. God, it's last year already. I can't believe it. And think about what was on my radar and what I thought would be useful for maybe some people to consider on their radar as well.
Okay, so we're going to come back to what's on your radar. That's actually what this is all about. But before we do that, for people that didn't work with you at TomTom, maybe you could give a little introduction to yourself and also a little bit to Xebialabs.
Sure. Okay, so my day job, I'm the chief PowerPoint developer. No, VP products, works out at being pretty much the same thing. At Xebialabs right now, my background is as a developer, so I started that. Well, actually, my background's in AI and maths, long time ago, and I worked as an enterprise software developer at TomTom, amongst other places, some other 3-letter companies that we probably shouldn't name because they're a bit boring. But I learned a lot about building high-performance systems in various guises, and I then joined via the consulting company Xebia. I joined Xebialabs, which is a products company, and we build software for continuous delivery and DevOps at scale. So, if you're 5 people in a college dorm and you have a couple of servers on Amazon, our tools will work great for you, but you probably won't need them yet. As you grow and as you start to hit all those inevitable, our CTO likes to call them grumpy old man problems, then we have a bunch of cool tools that can hopefully help you. And I still, PowerPoint's all very nice as a development environment, but I like to keep in touch with code. I get that obscure buzz from solving technical problems in a relatively elegant way. So between something like 10 and 2 in the morning, I contribute to a bunch of open source projects. I speak at a bunch of meetups. I work on some cloud stuff, some development stuff, and that helps keep me real, if you like, I think. Plus, it makes for interesting conversations with my girlfriend about why I'm still up, but that's a totally different discussion.
So in your work at Xebia, or let's say your work at Xebia makes you double interesting for this interview because you're solving, of course, software problems in-house by building software, but also, since you're selling business to business to software departments, you also have a unique view into how others are building software and what challenges they're facing.
Yes, absolutely.
Of that customer group that you're exposed to in your daily work, how many of them are already using container technologies?
I think an enormous amount of them. And just before I jump into this answer, for the avoidance of doubt, especially for our listeners in Netherlands, Xebia in the Netherlands and worldwide is a consulting organization. So if we say Xebialabs, we're a products company, just to make sure that distinction is there.
Oh, yeah. So for the rest of the interview, I will use Xebialabs instead of Xebia.
That's perfect. That would be great. All labs, that works fine.
Yeah.
Company name's not that interesting, I hope. Just what we do is cool. So back to your question. I think a lot of them are. I think for the majority of them, and this sort of mirrors some of the surveys that we saw coming out end of last year, most of them are thinking about it. They've obviously, somebody somewhere in every organization with more than 3 people under a rock has heard of container technology, or specifically Docker now. I think that's actually an interesting discussion we maybe won't have time for, learning lessons from other container technologies, because containers have been around for ages. It's not something that was invented last year. But they've all heard about this. They're all trying to figure out how to make it work. Very often we see containers discussed in combination with microservices, which I think is a very sensible combination. Somewhat less frequently, we see containers, I would say, quote unquote, abused as a kind of more lightweight VM cloud thing. And it's happening, and I'm not promoting it, but I think, one of the things that is going to be very challenging for people who are going to try and present expertise in this space is to give guidance on what works well and what doesn't work well. Because, we all know all the companies that did Agile by buying a whiteboard and a bunch of Post-it notes, and now they meet standing up instead of sitting down, and they think that means they're doing Agile. And I think containers, like any other technology, if we're going to make them as successful as I think they can be, it's going to be by making sure people understand what they're good for and what they're not good for, and preventing them from falling into lots of troughs of disillusionment. And I think part of that is understanding when to use them and when to leave them well alone.
Come back to one of the points in particular that caught my attention in your 8 things to keep in your mind if you're using Docker in 2015 or whatever it was called, and that was the question of storage, persistence. I don't know how you named it at the time.
I think one of the two.
Yeah. It was in the number 1 spot, and it's something that's on everyone's mind. Is this based on personal experience? Like, you've been using it and you're like, oh, this is fun, but now what do I do with my state? Or is it from customers, or is it internal at Xebialabs?
No, a little bit of everything, but I think it's based on, a lot of that ordering wasn't necessarily intended to reflect. Let me put it a different way. It was intended to reflect immediacy more than it's the elephant in the container room to some extent. Next to networking, which we may get to talk about, and there are specifically things like failover, because the bottlenecks change when you have a container landscape. So I think storage is the one that everybody is asking about. How is this going to work? Do we need to run a hybrid environment where we find a nice way to connect containers to services that run outside of containers? Do we find a nice shim interface that somehow makes a persistent store look like a container? If we've got containers that are as mobile as they promise to be, how do I make the storage as mobile as the containers if I'm doing disk mounts? Mm-hmm. How can I very quickly make that disk mount available somewhere else? I've spoken to some companies who, unfortunately, I can't say too much because some of it's under NDA, have very, very interesting, incredibly fast storage performance things, but it's stuff that they've had to think up in-house because there just is nothing on the market right now or in open source that will help you solve some of these problems. Because if you've got 10,000 containers running in a rack, or 1 million, and the rack goes down, then you have to think about all the bits that go with bringing those containers up somewhere else. And again, this is what I meant a little bit with the bottlenecks change. If these were VMs, more heavyweight VMs, then it would take you so long to spin up these VMs that the cost of binding IP addresses or changing routes or remounting disks is trivial by comparison. But if the container boot up time becomes really, really quick, then these other things suddenly are our next bottleneck. Yeah. And then you start to need to figure out how to deal with those kind of things. So storage is up there mainly because, I think if you're looking at containers right now, your compute Hello World experience is pretty slick. Mm-hmm. But your storage experience is something you need to think about.
So what's particularly interesting about this area is that it's and that's why it's been ignored, gone around, delayed, put off, whatever. It's one of those areas which really pushes back into the application stack. So this is not going to get solved for you a lot of the time. Now, famously, Netflix have gone for late consistency to be able to deal with some of these problems. Although, interestingly, they're not using containers as far as I'm aware. And that basically means, whereas getting the Hello World up and running that you mentioned is like free, like Docker does it for you and it does it real quick, the storage thing, like you said, it's going to require a bit of thought. And it seems like there are new ideas jumping up all the time. Similarly, in the service discovery space that you just touched on, if you're going to have to reroute, we see a new service discovery tool every week. That's because DNS simply isn't cutting it anymore, and that was sort of obvious to larger organizations in the past, and now it's getting more and more obvious every day. Is that again something that you're seeing from your customers? Do you have that sort of insight into their usage?
Yeah, well, so yeah, we do. I mean, of course, our specialty, if you like, what I get paid to think about in my day job is how to get stuff running. And it's it's great to have ideas. It's
Yeah.
great to be able to convert ideas into code really quickly. Whatever form that code takes, you then, if you really want to make, I mean, ultimately, this is all supply chain stuff, right? I mean, I was just coming off a call. We're in the software business, and we like to think of ourselves as doing unique stuff. But just-in-time engineering, getting T-shirts from your warehouse to your customer quickly is a problem that's been around for hundreds of years. We're not really doing anything all that new here. So my day job is to think about the bit you've written the code. How do you get it running, and how do you get it running not just for one small team, but you're in an organization where you might have tens or hundreds of teams, and you have thousands of these things that need to get running. So when we speak to people about, okay, so how do you want to improve that process? We obviously also have to find out about how they're trying to get the stuff running in the target environment. So yes, we do end up discussing a lot how they think about protecting their setup, although we don't generally have a lot of opportunity to influence that. I think service discovery is a particularly interesting one because, again, you see all the usual suspects from a tools perspective throwing one in there. Some of the frameworks that are coming out have a service discovery mechanism baked in, whether it's Zookeeper or whether it's HashiCorp's
Consul.
It's something with an S, I think. Can't remember.
Consul,
Google.
right?
Huh?
Consul?
Oh, Consul. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Mark is my friend, not Google. Mark's great. But there are others, and people have rolled their own. I know, for instance, Guild, when they did a nice presentation they gave 3 or 4 years ago about this, they use a load balancer to do some of this kind of stuff. So there's lots of different creative ways of solving this puzzle. I think one of the interesting ways is going up in the application stack, because as you say, DNS doesn't cut it. I've had some interesting discussions with people who are trying to solve this further down in the stack, which is a very interesting approach because, this moves from containers more to microservices a little bit. One of the things I think we have to be a little bit careful about is, pushing responsibility into the application design, because there is obviously, if you're solving a non-trivial business problem, that is probably ultimately the only place you can solve it. Mm-hmm. But one of the fallacies I think that we're seeing right now is that people think because it's easy to build a single service, it's easy to architect microservices at a large scale. And what they're ignoring a little bit here is that, I'm all for breaking up the monolith, like the 4,000, the internet in an ear file or whatever. Mm-hmm. But if those 4,000 components talk to each other, they will still have to talk to each other when they are microservices. So the complexity still exists. And, Marin Fowler said this very well. We just don't know quite yet how that's going to play out. Right. Because we don't necessarily have the tooling yet. We don't even have the experience yet beyond a couple of, highly sophisticated groups of people who've tried to do this, how this will play out. And I think the notion that, because writing a service is so easy, we now have this service discovery problem. Let's solve it at the application layer. That's definitely something you can consider, but maybe you should consider it more as a last resort than as something else. I had a very interesting and insightful conversation with someone who was an organizer of DevOps days, so a very DevOps-minded kind of person. And then his company was acquired by Google. Mm-hmm. And I asked him, so, what's it like this, working at Google, getting insight into how your applications run, the whole DevOpsy thing. He said, you know what? I have no idea how my applications run. It's magic, and I love it.
Right.
And I think, to me, this was very much an aha moment, because it means that if the platform you can provide is sufficiently capable that it doesn't hold people back from doing what they want, and it's sufficiently powerful, and it solves the problem sufficiently well. Developers, and I know this from myself, I don't care ultimately. I only have to care when I'm trying to do something that the platform doesn't provide, and then I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place. And I think containers, coming kind of full circle in this discussion, are very interesting because they give you a lot of interesting flexibility as to where you draw that platform boundary line. And let's not forget, most of the origins of containers in recent times are as implementation modules of a platform. So there is another interface on top of the container. And that's, if I look at the projects that we see both in small teams and in large teams, what they're effectively trying to do with containers is build their own paths. They don't necessarily talk about it that way.
Right. What I want to end with is, I think Adrian Cockcroft said it best. Docker was on nobody's radar for 2014. It's on everybody's radar for 2015. What's on your radar for 2015?
So what's on my radar for 2015? Well, some of it is trying to help organize a bunch of events that we may talk about in a little bit. But well, what's on my radar for 2015? From a professional perspective, it's making sure we can start to help people address some of the hard problems that come in this graph. Because, again, our job is, we're not supposed to tell you how to write your code. It's our job to make sure we can deliver that code effectively. Mm-hmm. It's our job to be able to say, look, you're moving from one enormous monolithic application with 10,000 things that you need to do to get running to this mesh of 80, 100, whatever services, some of which have interesting and complicated dependencies, and we want to make it just as easy for you to get those running in an arbitrary environment. And part of that means, giving you the flexibility to switch the underlying orchestration or grouping framework that you choose. I mean, you can use us, but you can also use Kubernetes or Docker Compose well, Fig used to be now Docker Compose, all these kind of things. But you have to be able to swap those out. I think in the kind of fast-moving space that this is, people are going to have to change. And then you have to be able to say things like, okay, well, what is the impact of putting this one service and all its dependencies in the environment? Mm-hmm. There's nothing. The irony is, I mean, I could probably say it in one sentence: think, Maven dependency graph for runtime, because. One of the things, I'm not saying it's an advantage, but one of the things that building monolithic applications did is it made all the dependencies build time. Mm-hmm. And, we spent 5 or 6 years as an industry trying to come up with tooling to handle this problem. You look at Maven or Gradle, all the build tools in their ecosystem and how they manage transitive dependencies and updating versions and ensuring you don't have conflicts. The problems are all the same. Yep. But they now move to runtime. Mm-hmm. And runtime means delivery time, means the kind of time where we come in, where our tools come in. So XL Deploy, specifically from a deployment perspective, is very much focused on this kind of challenge. Dependencies, automatic dependency management, flagging up constraints, concerns, conflicts, that kind of stuff. At a higher level, and I think this goes back a little bit to why we're building software in the first place, is, I'm really thrilled to see people adopting these things. As we've discussed, I think a slight note of caution, do it because you have a reason for doing it, because then you also know whether it works or not. If you're just doing it because it's the new hip thing out there, then it's going to be very hard for you to be happy or disappointed. It's more going to be a matter of luck. But the thing the thing that excites me a little bit is the notion that once we have simpler services that are easier, hopefully, to get running, and where we can really, make the cycle time happen. In other words, containers as a way of making agile deliverable, or microservices as a way of making agile deliverable. We can start to close that feedback loop, because I think as an industry, often it's like a chef who cares very much about how beautifully they cook the food and how many pans they use and how efficient that is, and they don't care about what it tastes like. Mm-hmm. And that's a really, it's a really odd thing. Like I don't think we're hugely customer or users focused, or we don't have much user empathy as an industry. And I think, what containers is a great step forward towards changing faster, helping our users better, and of course also, finding out what our users really want so that we can change, we can help them quicker as well. So the bigger picture, and I mean our other tooling. XL Test is about maintaining a kind of quality overview, making sure that the stuff you're delivering is good, and understanding what your users are saying about it once it's out there. And XL Release is really a pipeline orchestrated to allow you to do that whole concept to cache thing. So that's really the space in which I'm playing, if you like, professionally. Personally, I'm going to be very interested to see how, well, first of all, how containers work with the rest of your landscape. I think the notion that you're sort of going to rip out everything that you have and then magically you're going to build this new thing, that partially going to happen, but you're going to have to figure out a way to connect the things. So there'll be some tools, some types of applications that you use there. I think the connectivity, and this is more at an application level, at like reactive microservices type level, mm-hmm. The linking between server-side apps and say mobile apps or these kind of things is I think I'm waiting to see what happens in that space, because if you write an app nowadays, you're writing some kind of message-based system typically. If you think about it, the way you send a message to another microservice is totally different. You use different libraries, different calls, different error handling from sending a message to a mobile phone. And of course, they have different characteristics as nodes in your graph. But why are you doing this? Why don't you have one consistent messaging paradigm across your computing landscape? Because then you can start to do things like, well, I'm going to measure all the messages going across my network. And I don't care whether the message goes from one server node to another server node, or a server node to a database, or a server node to a fridge. So I think that's going to be an interesting one technically. And of course, as an industry observer, I'm going to sit back and watch the bun fight, because I think we have a couple of going by Adrian's comment, we have a couple of interesting things happening. Potentially, the first threat to all the Linux operating system vendors in maybe a decade, like their widespread usage in enterprise environments is under threat for the first time. People are going to say, "Why do I need RHEL if I can just have CoreOS and Docker or whatever?" Yep. We're going to see what Docker tries to do in terms of actually adding commercial value to some of their things. And I think we're seeing already they're moving into like the enterprise, the platform management of Docker containers. And a natural thing for them to do is then say, well, you saw with the Rocket announcement, I think that was an obvious, understandable case. Right. CoreOS is saying, well, it looked good because we were going to be the default OS underneath Docker, but maybe Docker's going to come out with something themselves and say, well, why do we need to give this money to CoreOS if we can sell you the OS that's optimized for Docker? I don't know. But I think to see how the vendors will, what they're going to throw into this space is going to be fun as an industry observer. I fear that it's not going to be quite so good for the users, because it's going to result in the same kind of massive confusion and proliferation of different standards, different paradigms for doing things. We had a discussion recently with some colleagues who were putting in a proposal to run a microservices platform, and they said the thing that they missed most sorely is some kind of standard, not just for an individual container, but actually for a network of containers, which is the real problem you have to solve. Because they know that all these immature tools, one will win out, another will not win out, and if you have to pick one now, you don't want to back the wrong horse. So I think the industry could help itself a lot here with standardization. And, as old-fashioned and boring as it sounds, ultimately I think a lot of the success of Java in the enterprise came because the Java EE standard meant that you had a well-defined interface between your applications. It's a DevOps interface ultimately, and your runtime.
So it relates to, I guess, it comes back to the point you were making before. I think you called it commoditization, but I'm not quite sure. Yes. And we see the same thing coming up now. We can't really make huge inroads unless we get to standardization or some reasonable standardization, which leads to commoditization. And interestingly here, what I hadn't thought about before is messaging as a commoditized resource, because if that happens, then again, we solve this sort of Tower of Babel issue that we were talking about before, where every container needs to know how to speak 50 languages to get its job done. Okay, very interesting. That's all we have time for. Like I said, I think 3 times already. I'd love to carry on, but at some point I've got to edit this bad boy. So for now, I will say Andrew Phillips from Xebialabs, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Maybe just one quick 2-minute shout out. A very interesting announcement I saw coming up in March, I think, in Austin, Container Days. Mark the name. Community event. Think DevOps Days for containers. I think you're thinking right. I sense growth.
You sense growth. Context-sensitive statement, if I ever heard one. And a perfect time to end. Andrew, thank you very much.